on Transnational Everyday Life. This is going to be our first talk of this term. I would like to thank NYU Postcolonial Program and South Asia at NYU for funding this event. And in particular, I would like to thank Professor Robert Young, who has been very generous in terms of funding and support for this particular event. And Professor David Ludden as well, because when I spoke to him, he immediately agreed South Asia and NYU would possibly be part of it. And I would like to thank Rajiv Menon, who is the coordinator of postcolonial program at NYU now in the department. And also Nadia Khalid, who is coordinating South Asia, NYU at South Asia. So these two have been really helpful in putting this up. And finally, and not finally, most importantly, I'm now going to introduce Professor Rukmini Bhaya Nair. Very briefly, both. Professor Rukmini Bhaya Nair is a professor of linguistics and English at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. She received her PhD from University of Cambridge and has since taught at universities ranging from Singapore to Stanford and delivered plenary addresses in places like Aarhus to all the way Xinjiang. And she has been awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Antwerp in 2006 for her contributions to the fields of linguistics and literary theory. Her academic books include Poetry in a Time of Terror, which was published by Oxford University Press, New Delhi and New York in 2009. Narrative Gravity, Conversation, Cognition and Culture, published by Routledge. Lying on the Postcolonial Couch, published by Minnesota and Oxford in 2002. And a very interesting book, Technograph, Culture in a Cybernetic Classroom, which was published by HarperCollins way back in 1997. And she's also the editor of Biblio, one of India's leading literary review journals. And I'm going to ask someday if I could publish something there. And she's also on the editorial board of several international peer-reviewed journals. She has been called the first significant postmodern poet in Indian English. She has published 3 books of poetry: The Hyoid Bone, The Ayodhya Cantos, and the Yellow Hibiscus, all published by Cambridge. And her poems have been anthologized and translated into many languages. According to Professor Nair, she does research for the same reasons that she writes poetry, to discover the possibilities and limits of language. And on a very personal note, I was working with her way back, almost a decade back in Delhi, and that's how I know Professor Nair. Thank you so much for coming, Professor Nair. And tonight, the respondent is Dr. Toral Dajawala, who is our very own from our own department. She's an assistant professor of English and comparative literature at NYU, and she's been the winner of 48 William Riley Parker Prize for her article, Sometime Between Revisionist and Revolutionary, Unreading History in Dalit Literature, which appeared in 2011. And she's the author of just published Untouchable Fictions, Literary Realism and the Crisis of Caste, published by Fordham, and it looks an exciting book. So thank you once more, and I welcome Professor Nair, and over to you.
I'm very pleased to be here, and it's always a privilege to talk to interested people about one's work, especially one's current work. I want to thank all the people who Musharraf has thanked, and I want to thank Musharraf himself for arranging this at the end of term, which it must be quite hard. As you must have guessed from that introduction, I'm all over the place. I'm interested in lots of things, and they don't always go here. Today's talk is also of that nature. It's fairly mixed in its approach, and my main sort of purpose is to try to discuss ideas in progress, work in progress. So it's called, my talk is called In Search of Darwin's Orient, and I think if we have time, we'll try to see a small film at the end of this. And if we don't have time, well, another time. And so let me begin with the quotation from Edward Said, which gave me my title in this evening's talk. And Said says, there was and is a linguistic Orient, a Freudian Orient, a Spenglerian Orient, and so on, a Darwinian Orient. And these are all these Orients are entangled. So I'm particularly interested in the way that Said has slipped in the hyphen, there was and is a linguistic Orient. So it's not that this Orient was in the past, it's that it is there now. So I want to discover what this Orient is now, not only what it was in historical terms. And of course, Said, a little later on in that same introduction talks about Flaubert's portrait of the Oriental woman, and says she never spoke, this is well known in post-colonial theory, but she never revealed herself, her emotions, and her history. I'm particularly interested in that notion of the emotions, which I want to look at the boundaries between the emotions and language, as it was discussed, by Darwin. So I'm going to be talking about the Oriental woman towards the end of my talk, and my main focus today will be on the connection between the so-called Darwinian Orient and the linguistic Orient. Now, my paper is divided. I've divided this paper, or this talk, rather forcibly into 3 parts. And one is on Darwin, the second is on a person who lived maybe around the 1st century, maybe around the 4th, and somewhere in that period, but whose thoughts are still quite relevant today in Indian everyday life. And finally, I'm going to talk about some research that I have been doing, or we have been doing in our group, which is called the Language, Emotion and Culture Group. And I'll show you a film to do with the work of that group that we have done. But you might ask, Darwin, Bharata, work you have been doing, how does all this cohere, except for the general sort of in context of the emotions? And I have, of course, used this rather plebeian word, 3 sections, but one could use more sophisticated word like heterology, and what one would be doing there would be talking in terms of something like deserters, the practice of everyday life. And he said, he made this famous distinction between, which all of you probably know much better than me, which is the distinction between a strategy, which is something very sort of what he called a kind of calculus of time and place, and a tactic, which he said was something much weaker. A tactic, he said, seizes upon moments which don't necessarily cohere, but seeks to bring together lots of different lines of thought. And and he called tactic something which is a measure of the weak. And I think that the connections which we're going to see in today's talk are fairly weak connections. So it will partly depend on how we interpret the tactical nature of this talk. So these sections, how they cohere, is going to be the main problem that we are going to confront in today's talk. I think that if I were asked, what am I looking for? Why am I presenting this talk? I would like to say that I myself am in an interdisciplinary place. The work we are doing in our group today involves linguistics, philosophy, anthropology, and psychology. And so it's a question of method. How would you bring different kinds of insights together? And we know that the notion of observation is fairly fundamental in many disciplines. I don't know about literature, but certainly in psychology, in anthropology, participant observation, in quantum mechanics, the observer's paradox. Observation is pretty fundamental to a range of disciplines. So I'm going to be really looking, when I look at Darwin, look at Paradox, look at our own work, what observational method is. How do you find it in a text? How do you find it in the society? How do you look for? How do you use observations? And in this, I take my inspiration from Darwin himself, who said, I have no great quickness of apprehension or wit. My power to follow along an abstract argument is limited. But I am superior to the common man in noticing things which easily escape attention and observing them carefully. This notion of observation, which he presented in this book, which I'm going to discuss, the expression of man, the expression of the emotions in man and animals, was quite important because he embarked on this project long after the art of observation had paid Darwin, had paid huge dividends, because he was then well established as somebody who had suggested the theory of evolution. But that he turned his attention to emotions was quite important, and that he talked about the role of observation in looking at emotions, and we'll see how he looked at them. This was to be critical in trying to understand what we see when we read the text. So this is the book. It was published in 1872. What Darwin did was he followed a methodology which psychologists swear by, anthropologists use. He sent questionnaires around. He observed, as I shall show you, his own community for expressions of emotion, that is people in England around him and so on. And he consulted experts on what emotions were at the time, what they thought emotions were. And he used a set of pictures, which I will show you in a minute. And his hypothesis was very simple, and it derived from his understanding of evolution, which is that that there must be, among all the variations, there must be something invariant, and there was commonness across cultures in the expression of emotion. Not only commonness across cultures, but commonness across species. So he thought, for example, dogs or swans would exhibit anger and rage in the same way that human beings would. So this was a bold hypothesis, and he was very careful, he tabulated everything. So he sort of sent this questionnaire to all 5 continents, 34 countries, and we will look at the questionnaire in a minute. So these were the pictures, and Darwin's publisher actually told him, don't use photographs. They are very expensive because it was a new technique at the time. Why can't you just use drawings? And he did use drawings, but he wanted to use a new technology, and that's really paid off because you can see these facially. And there he's comparing a Duchenne's expression, which some people interpret as smiling, I don't know how, and a real smile. And then he looked at actors, and he looked at how they might express sadness and disdain and so on and so forth. Famous actors of his time, so it's not as if he didn't take the arts into consideration. And he was interested in everyday expressions, not just literary expressions or expressions by actors, but everyday expressions. So those were some of the pictures that he collected. He was very interested in children and how children showed emotion, including his own children. So, and he was very interested in how simian species bonded. So he was retesting his hypothesis about common expressions across cultures in the field of emotions by basically looking at the outward expression of emotions. So these were the questions he asked. Is astonishment expressed by the eyes and mouth being opened wide and by the eyebrows being raised? Does shame excite a blush? And so on. And of course, you know, we put these questions to Indian the respondents with some very quite interesting results. And we can see that there is an Orientalism here, because when you come to extreme fear, which is the last one, you see he says, is extreme fear expressed in the same general manner as with the Europeans? So there is a norm there, and he is asking all these respondents across the globe, he's assuming that they know what extreme fear was and contrasting it with the European manner. So these questions are, you know, they were important questions, and he tabulated his answers to these questions by saying, you know, how do the Pygmies do it, and how do the Calcutta Bengalis do it, and so on and so forth. So very careful observer, very careful he described these emotions quite carefully, the Ethiopians, the Nigerians, the Calcutta Bengali, and very detailed. I don't know whether you can read them, but he says things like, you know, how many times the skull rotates on the axis of the neck and so on. So he's quite careful, and he's looking at all this cultural variation, suggesting that something like laughter is used in many different ways. So he differentiates quite smartly between laughter, which can be elicited through jokes and so on and so forth, and happiness, which has a completely different kind of expression. So these were quite accurate observations. Whether one goes along with Darwin's hypothesis or not, it's quite interesting how he spent so much time just looking at these various emotions of disgust and contempt, and coming up with a list of basic emotions, which we'll come to. Now, if we were to ask a question, like, supposing we sent the same questionnaire around today, what answers would we get? Would we get the same type of answers across cultures or not? But we just started this enterprise, maybe just for fun, just to check whether people would have the same responses. And you know, could we extend Darwin's analysis to how people interpret mental states in the arts, like films, dance, and so on? So we can do this. We can look at ragas. We can look at the rasa theory of Bharata, which is interesting because in India, this theory, the rasa theory, has been around for a long time and is part of everyday vocabulary as well as high theory. So I looked at Bharata's representation of the emotions in the sense that Bharata, we don't know what he looked like. So that picture is an imagined picture of Bharata, and I want to set up a conversation between Darwin and Bharata, whom we know very well in the Indian context, as somebody who produced a theory of the emotions in dance and arts and so on, and in histrionics, in drama, and whose theory today is very much alive because there are girls across India learning dance. There are lots of art forms, and what the theory, the residual theory that they use, is Bharata's theory. So the word rasa is known to everyone, and Bharata's work in that form, not in its sort of expanded textual form, but in its lived and performative sense, is available to a lot of India, in many dance forms and in lots of performative arts like Kathakali. Now, Bharata himself, so this has gone off.
Yeah.
And is it because I've moved this? Is that okay? So, Bharata, this is the beginning of the text, and he was asked, how did this text of yours originate? And he situates it in everyday life. He says that you know, the rest of the Vedas could only be, these sacred texts could only be read by the Brahmins, but there should be a text which can be available, which is available to everybody, and that text is to be listened to by those born as Sudras, and which will belong to everyone, and which will be audible and visible. So this text is a text which is meant to belong to everyone, a text about specifically the emotions. So if we compare Darwin's text to Bharata's, just a list of emotions, what we find is quite interesting, because Darwin says the surprise, sorrow, happiness, disgust, fear, and also post-Darwinians like Ekman, Paul Ekman today at Berkeley, say these are the basic emotions, and Bharata has them all, and Bharata calls them the major emotions, the dominant bhavas, the dominant emotions, and they are love, laughter, sorrow, anger, energy Darwin doesn't have, but fear and disgust. So these emotions have, in many different traditions, been classified as basic. So our research question was, are they basic? In what way are they basic today? Can we say that these emotions are basic? Why should they be basic, rather than indignation, frustration, anxiety, worry? Why should those things not be basic? Why should these things be basic? That was the question we began with. Okay, so Bharata is he's like Darwin. I mean, I'm sure Darwin would have loved Bharata, because he's so, you know, meticulous in description. So he says, for example, disgust should be set up by contracting the limbs, spitting, narrowing down of the mouth, covering the nose, contracting all the limbs, uneasiness and heartache. So this is his description of disgust. So he's really saying, answering Darwin's question, how is disgust expressed in your culture? And we have also presented, so astonishment, he does the same thing, wide opening of the eyebrows, although I don't know how the eyebrows can be opened, but what he means is raising of the eyebrows. And he has very particular, like every single, what he calls the minor limbs, all facial expressions and bodily expressions are very, very sharply described in Bharata. So, you know, it's an absolutely fascinating text to read today. So, and his theory was that this was part of the dance of the universe, but it was also something which you found in everyday life, in the language and in the bodily movements of women, how ministers moved, how kings moved, how common people used their limbs. All this was part of his description of what the emotion, what it was to express an emotion. Rasa, that he used, was an old word, and it remains part of our ordinary everyday talk. So Saraswati is flowing. So rasa, you find it in the name of this goddess. You find it in words like rasam, you know, which is something to eat. So it is definitely part of everyday life. And you find rasa. So Bharata's use of rasa came out of a long Rigvedic tradition where people use rasa in the sense of the juices of the body, the sacred juice of the soma plant. And people like Gertz talk about rasa in terms of the two types of rasa, everyday social significance, tacit import and so on, as well as a mystical sense of something that might exist beyond, a psychic sense which might exist beyond expression. And many cognitive linguists have tried to explain the term rasa and finally said that it's untranslatable because it's spread across the everyday life and language of a culture. So rasa itself has many explanations even today. It's not as if it's a forgotten term. done with. It was and is part of everyday life. So now, the important thing here is we're talking, it seems a long time ago, but we were talking about the observational method. Now, rasa as emotion is very differently understood by Bharata from the way that rasa or emotion was understood by Darwin. For Darwin, it was something to be observed in facial expressions, in bodily movements, but for Bharata, it was something to be created rather than merely recreated. So you created an emotion, it was embodied during a performance. And how was this achieved? So there was a kind of explanation that which children learn, which is Vibhava Anubhava Vyavharichari Sanyoga Rasha Anishpatti, which is that you have to have a context, and then you have to have bodily experience, and then you have a number of confused indirect states, and if all these come together, then you have all the elements of a rasa, and the last part has to be created on stage by the actor. And in everyday life we act, so we create that last stage of the rasa. So rasa theory says that you can't just point to a rasa. It is performative, it is a process rather than a thing, and much depends on the audience. So the notion of an emotion is very much reciprocal in this sense, whereas Darwin was not at all interested in the notion of reciprocity in emotion. He was interested in how an emotion was expressed, and he was very careful, but he was not interested in how it was received. So it was not interesting to him. So rasa theory privileges the community, the shared universe which the actor and the rasic, the audience, have together. So what is the observational method in rasa theory? It is based on reciprocity, and you have to, even when the dancer is intimately, or the actor is intimately absorbed in their art, the other is always there. The other is a psychic presence in the creation of a rasa. So in this respect, the observational method which Bharata seems to present is different from Darwin's. And the other important point to note about rasa theory before we move on to what we are trying to do is that it is often presented in a codified language, and this is the language of hand gestures and movements. So if I sort of ask you as an audience to read these expressions, can you do so? Or these hand gestures? You cannot, right? And that's partly because these are codified, these are learned, these are arbitrary, and they have language-like characteristics. So there is, the performative element is also there in the actual hand gestures, which cannot be read without acculturation, without immersion in culture. So, and we've done this with stick figures, and again, people vary widely in their interpretation of stick figures. So, and then we presented it to people, dancers, Darwin's questions, in terms of how they might answer this notion of the naturalness of the emotions. And so we asked the Maya Rao, a dancer, is astonishment expressed by the eyes and the mouth being opened wide, as Darwin said, and by the eyebrows being raised? Maya said yes, but the mouth is closed in Kathakali by convention. So Darwin says, is laughter ever carried to such an extreme as to bring tears into the eyes? And Maya says Kathakali has no use use for anything as naturalistic as tears. And so in each case, what they're talking about is overcoming the natural and presenting it in a codified language, in a culturally available language, which is not necessarily available to everyone. The emotion is there, but not necessarily the language. So that is my doing the thing. So what's the upshot? Well, I think that an upshot is that if you indulge in this illegitimate method of getting insights from Darwin as well as from Paratha on the grounds that both talked about the emotion. One is that you could get a cultural critique of Darwin by looking at it in terms of a language which is already available within a culture, and you can talk about the constructiveness of the emotions. So when we asked another dancer, she's very famous, she's the head of Kalakshetra, and when we asked her, how do you say yes and no? She says it's only children who say no to mean no. Those better skilled at conveying an emotion may say no to mean yes. This is especially true of a rasa like Shringara, which is love. So she's saying that, what acculturation is about is precisely not about showing your emotions. It's about teaching people not to point, although that might be a natural gesture, because cultural control inheres in imposing or in creating a language of the emotions, which goes beyond just accepting the expression of the emotion as it is, and we'll never know what the expression of the emotion as it is. So our research begins with Leela Sampson's point. It's only children who say no to mean no and yes to mean yes. Is this true? So our question is, how do emotions develop in human beings? How do we have them? Because people do say that the main difference between us and machines, and we are very good at programming machines with language and so on, what we're not so good at is even being able to conceptualize a thinking machine. What's a feeling machine? What's a feeling machine like? So are children really natural in the expression of their emotions, as Sampson assumes? Many people have assumed that Lacan before the mirror stage, lots of people, or does culture go all the way down? How do we understand emotions in children? So now here is where the methodological question comes up. Supposing we say that supposing we take current research on how the emotions develop in a culture, in a society, what we have had is a clear methodological bias towards observing children as they display emotions. Now, how do we observe children? We train researchers, we put cameras on the children, and we observe how they show disgust and anger and so on and so forth. Now, this method, this observational method, has limitations because it takes away context, environment, reciprocity from the experimental situation. So how do we deal with this when we talk about emotions? And this was something which concerned us. We wanted to know how we could get away from the objective bias. We read a lot of things, and most of all we read, and one of the people we read was this researcher who's written a book at Berkeley called The Philosophical Baby, and she says babies are born as experimentalists. They want to discover the world around them. They're little scientists in miniature. So babies learn about the world based on what they see their parents do. These actions influence them, and a naturally sad baby, this is the sentence I take away, observes a sad mother and concludes that sadness is the human condition. But when Alison Gopnik actually deals with babies, she takes them to a lab and she does experiments with them. So this is her philosophical belief, but what she does because of the constraints of observational method in psychology today, is that she has to prove that a baby shows sadness under laboratory conditions as well. Okay, so we asked instead, could we consider mothers who are engaged in everyday intimate interactions with their children to be the best observers, not the researcher, but the mother of the child? Could we use mothers' memories to actually understand how emotions develop? Could we use memory as an anthropological resource, as a linguistic resource, to understand the growth of the emotions? And this is a radical departure, because as far as I know, I have read hundreds of studies and I've only found one which actually did, and that's with abused children, which asked mothers, how did you feel? But usually this is very rare. You've never tapped mothers. And we have done perhaps the largest study. So we wanted to ask, I depart a little bit here, and I don't have too much more to say, so I hope this is not getting too boring, but I'll just take you through a bit of this. But our research, as a linguist, you learn that language develops across a long period of time. So it develops across 4 years, whereas the other modalities like sight and touch and taste develop much earlier, but you're ready to go with touch and taste and whatever, so on. But not, my hypothesis was that it wasn't, language and emotion was slow growing. They grew over time across 4 years. You didn't have shame as a very young baby, but you were quite likely to have something like love or something, or trust. So could we say that language and emotion grow together in tandem? And if we did, could we show this? So our methodology was to use mothers, and our question was, could there be an emotional acquisition device? Remember, our grant is from the Department of Science and Technology, so we had to put this in EAD language, but the basic question is, do they grow in tandem in culture? So we use a 3-stage observational method: recognition, recall, and record, and I'll explain what these mean. So recognition. The question, we created a file. I have that file here, so we can show it to you. And it's the largest ever study, because most studies so far have looked at 7 or 8 basic emotions. We looked at 24. And we combined Darwin, Bharata, and our own intuitions about anxiety and so on. We had 24 in each emotion. We had 4 pictures. And one was furthest away, one was quite close, one was far away, and one was random. And we asked people to choose which was the best expression of emotions. So first we did this with 500 mothers. Then I thought, if we do it with 500 mothers, people will say to us, you tested only women, you only tested mothers. Why not test males as well? So what we found was that it was amazing, and I was shocked. We found that everybody could identify these pictures online, like, they could just say, yes, this is the closest, this is the furthest, and I am 100% sure, or I'm quite sure, that's it, not 100%, maybe 70% or something, that if you showed our files to an Indian audience, to an American audience, they would choose the same. Okay, so what we're getting is we have 24 emotions. There's 90% recognition with disgust and laughter being recognized the highest, all these. And the one we're getting the lowest recognitions on are helplessness and contempt. Now helplessness, there is an explanation, which is helplessness is not shown on the face. It's shown by the body language. But you wanted to ask a question?
The pictures, were there actual natural emotions? Like, was a person feeling helpless?
No, we did 2, yes, we did 2 tests. So far, one test which has been used throughout which Ekman and hundreds of other researchers have used, is stills, including Darwin. We recognized that this was a weakness, but we thought we should have a parallel methodology to Ekman's and so on. So we did this. But we also made films in naturalistic situations, which I'm going to show you. So we made 20 films on these emotions because we felt it was important to look at it in naturalistic situations. And we have 500 hours of tapes where the mothers talk about their emotions. So we felt that we should look at reciprocity, intimacy, and so on, but we should not let go of the standard method, because if we did that, then people would say to us, well, you know, you just went and filmed people randomly, you know, you did not do a picture recognition task. So we did it, but we did it with 20, you know, with these 24 emotions and 4 for each, which is more systematic than most studies so far. So this is only one thing, but the main point I want to make here is, if you look at this graph, there is no evidence that basic emotions are basic, because everybody is recognizing all the emotions, men, women, everybody, and so that's the first conclusion we drew, that the basic emotions are not basic on this test. And men and women, there are differences. These are the significant differences. It's not that interesting, but men are better at recognizing contempt, which was the one women found most, and love. Women are better at almost everything else, but both have very high levels, so it's not really so important. Now, we thought we'll look at another measure. Let's look at women. You know, let's look at the mothers who were the original people in our study. Let's look at when they recall an emotion first appeared in their infant, tapping their memories. And when we got 500 mothers' responses, we could see no pattern. And then we separated the bands, and this is what we found. And it's so clear that it's quite startling. What we found is all our 500 mothers said happiness was the first emotion they recognized in their child. This coheres with lots of studies which have been done all over the world, because happiness is a basic emotion. So everybody studied it. So, and we found that laughter and sadness, they came in clusters. And right at the end, mothers were reporting, very few mothers actually said they saw contempt in their children. So we were able, and one of the things we noticed is happiness was this positive emotion, and then we got sadness and laughter, and the other emotions were two positive and two negative, balanced all the way until the last stages, because negative emotions are much more than positive emotions. You know, they're named, and they are more kind of always present as they sort of exceed across cultures and are also the basis of literary and other descriptions. Negative, what we call negative, I mean they're not really negative, but sort of sadness and so on and so forth. So we're finding a stage-by-stage growth, but we feared something. We feared that we divided our mothers into mothers of very young children, mothers of somewhat older children, and older mothers, and we found a recency effect that mothers of young children saw their emotions earlier in their children. Okay? But we found the exact same pattern. So the emotions that were remembered as basic were basic, but the older mothers remembered it occurring later, and the younger mothers. So this is, we had accepted that. We had expected that, sorry. And we also found that lots of mothers, and this disturbed us, were telling us that they never saw this emotion in their children. They never saw it, so they couldn't remember it. So why didn't they see it, and what didn't they see? Now we found that if it was a negative emotion, and it came early, it was a basic emotion, then they didn't mind admitting that they saw it in their children. So they did see fear, they did see anger, they did see disgust. These are the basic emotions of their children. But when it came to the negative emotions like contempt and hate, contempt, almost 70% of mothers are saying they didn't see it at all in their children. So they're telling us that not that they don't recognize the emotion, they do, but they don't see it in their own children. And we looked at lots of narrative data. Maybe we don't have time for this, but we saw that most of the basic emotions have a larger number of narratives, and the least narrativized emotions are contempt, hate, and so on. What kind of codes did we look at? We looked at things like closed eyes. This is what the category the mothers used. We looked at narrative transcripts, so we can skip this, but what we found is that there was a range from happiness, which was high recognition, high recall, high embedding, high everything, to contempt, which was low recognition, low recall, low frequency, low everything. So there is a kind of recognition pattern which mothers have. And if we just quickly look at some demographic data, what we find is that mothers in joint families recall an emotion earlier consistently. So we had half our families were joint families and half our families were not, nuclear families. And there's a clear distinction. Joint family, mothers of children brought up in joint families recognize an emotion earlier. We are trying to explain this result. We also found that lower socioeconomic groups recognize certain emotions better, but they are negative emotions: sadness, fear, boredom, jealousy, reflection. Pride and peacefulness is recognized better. So we don't have to go through all these statistics. But what is interesting is that if we look at mothers who are not working, mothers who are low income, and mothers who are don't have these high degrees of education, what we find is they're actually better at recognizing lots of emotions, but those emotions are negative ones. So if we look now at observational stances, we can see that Darwin's is typically a scientist stance which is detached and disengaged and sort of the observer stance. If we look at Bharata, he's talking about the reciprocal and performative elements of an emotion. And the Indian mothers are very much emerging out of a situation of intimacy and introspection. So this was one way of bringing introspection back with fairly clear results. So it's not as if introspection doesn't give us the kind of results if you do it across a large group and you use storytelling. So my point is that if you want to understand the nature of emotional growth, and we have found that it extends from 0 to 3.5 years, paralleling language. One of the things we have to do is to look at various sorts of evidence, literary evidence, social evidence of various types, methods such as doing large-scale studies, and also to look at the psychic states as connected with a whole context, a cultural context. So this is our current endeavor. I think we'll end there for now.
Are you watching the film?
If you want, but it's quite long. So
I
mean, it's about 10 minutes, the film.
Do you want to watch it?
I can actually show you two films. One, you can choose which one. The one is very interesting from a Darwinian point of view, and it's extremely rare footage. So you would be seeing it for the first time. The film I chose for today is a 10-minute film, and it's on obstinacy, which is a children's emotion, and it's got a name, Zid, in India. And Zid is culturally understood emotion. So that was the film I was planning to show. But we also shot, because I was so enthusiastically discussing Darwin with my filmmakers, we shot a monkey mother who did something which was very unusual and points to individual differences in tactics among other species. She, the babies in that monkey, the males in that monkey community were neutered, so she couldn't have babies. So what she did was to pick up puppies and rear them as her own children, except that the puppies died because she would feed them grass and leap across rooftops with them. And in this film, what we've got is this monkey mother actually showing a kind of a huge maternal instinct and rearing the puppy, protecting the puppy, as if it was a monkey baby. And that's so unusual that it is very, it's to me very, very interesting. On the other hand, we can look at the human community we've been studying, and we can just look at obstinacy, or we could look at neither. Monkey film is, I should say, 6.5 minutes, and the other one is about 10 minutes. Show that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
I was
sure.
under the impression, but perhaps I'm mistaken, that there's this guy in UCSF who does microfacial expressions.
Yes.
There's a horror TV show about it as well, which is a horror topic. But apparently he has found that, well, so you seem to indicate that babies learn emotions from their parents, which would mean that it's very cultural, like language, as you've said. But he claims that it transcends, that the emotions are universal and facial expressions are universal.
Yes, they are universal. What we're finding is that there is a basic set, like the mother's report happiness, and those are the basic emotions, and all the basic emotions are shown in the mother's recall as occurring earlier, which would point to the fact that they transcend cultural cultural factors entirely, because the mothers are remembering the basic
It could be that
emotions
the
earlier.
children, I mean, if all the mothers were from the same culture, I mean,
Then they would still,
children
our
could be mimicking
hypothesis,
their parents, right?
yes, our hypothesis is that yes, the basic emotions are a sort of part of your natural inheritance, but culture works on them. So that it is not that they continue to show in the same way. And Ekman's work, to which I think you're referring, says that he can detect, for example, lying in children or lying in anybody. Some experts can do this, and not everybody can do this, but experts can do this because certain muscles don't actually perform that well, even when you are showing certain facial expressions. And the same is true of various complex emotions. So as you go up the scale with contempt and so on and so forth, those are required later on, and culture kicks in much more obviously. In the early emotions, they are natural, but culture still works on them, so that they don't remain so natural as you move up the cultural scale, because it's just like we have a phoneme sequence in language, or we have, two-word stages and so on and so forth. But, no adult speaks in two-word stages or uses the same kind of combinations of phonemes, because the culture works and prunes those initial states which are natural that we have. I'm suggesting that the same thing happens with language, and the two work together. So what you're saying is right. There are natural states, but I would not say that they're natural states in the sense that Darwin assumed that you show this all the time across cultures and we are immediately able to recognize these things. We are not. And what our mother's studies have shown is that mothers too are able to recognize these states, but they won't admit it when it comes to their own children. They say our children simply do not show hate. Not that they can't read hate, because we did recognition studies first, but they won't say it because that's where culture plays a role. So does that answer your question?
Can you have the response first and then?
No, sure. I'm thinking along similar lines. But I have a few different questions. I guess one, just to continue our conversation here, which is, in literary study, memory is such a crucial rubric, object of analysis. It's kind of a method and a mechanism, and it's privileged precisely because it presents an alternative to quote-unquote objective historical forms of knowledge. So what allowances did the study make for memory as a method, right?
Yes, memory as a method has not been used surprisingly so much in psychology, but of course somebody like Freud, when he talks about the psychopathology of everyday life, begins with memory and says, why does memory trip us up all the time? We can't remember names, why is it not a resource which is constantly available to us in everyday life? And so memory becomes, in a way, the Orient, the unknown for us, and therefore a major resource which we can use to create counterfactual worlds. And he says, Freud says we have screen memories. And in literature, of course, you think, if you think of Proust or you think of anybody else, you're working off memory, but that memory is not supposed to be or meant to be the exact historical record. Now, what we thought is that if you have 500 mothers, and it's not that they don't have biases, but when they tell their stories, and we presented them with age bands, and we said to them, when did you record this in your child? And what is the emotion you first recorded? Tell us the incidents around it. And we put together those results. What we found is something surprising, which is that we found that they did remember quite consistently that certain emotions came earlier. This is quite apart from the fact that they made up some of their memories. I bet they did. But when you do so much, then what you find is a pattern. And we were looking for a pattern, not that memories are always true, but that memories can be relied on introspectively to give you cultural knowledge. So that is one way of looking at memory. Another way of looking at memory is to say it's anti-everyday. It's kind of another world which you go into. And I think both, and my plea would be that both have to be used when one has to understand something, like how does one feel something at a certain time. So feeling, in the literary text, feeling is one thing, and in the mother's memory, feeling is something else, but the two have kind of jointures, kind of areas where they cohere. So those are the areas which are of interest to me.
Yeah, I was thinking of memory just in anthropology, I guess, how the motherhood, mothering becomes the cultural repository of memory, right? So memory in most places are kind of gender problematic, and so that it's mothers who should remember, can remember, do remember. We don't assume that they're right or incorrect, but they also have to perform their knowledge of memory because that also shows the way that they.
But is that, I don't know enough about anthropology, but I would say that many kinds of memories are privileged in anthropology, and not all of them are mother's memories. In fact, cultural memories are, one might think, heavily patriarchal, and not mother's memories. And even if, when one tries to think of it, the only dreams or memories that one can recall are memories of birth, which women have. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that it is an anthropological sine qua non that mother's memories are privileged. I'm not sure. But yeah. I thought it was interesting to use it in psychology, because in psychology it hadn't been used, or in linguistics.
One of the
when we talk about collective memory only in a metaphorical sense, what you're describing are capacities, innate capacities or culturally tempered capacity for memory, but how does a collective emotion arise? And in particular, I mean, is it just a triggering of a variety of individual capacities in a given moment? But in particular, how do we think about the emergence of a collective memory in a moment that seems unprecedented? For example, indignation in a revolution, or enthusiasm, or hope.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question. And what is collective memory, and do children have access to collective memory? And I would say, the psychologists say, Freud and Jung says, we have access to some kind of collective unconscious. I'm not sure about that, but what I do think is that, from very early on, you have the narrativization of the collective. And you hear this quite early, so, prejudices, biases. For example, in our stories about contempt, they were all about different communities. Long before the child has any idea of what a Muslim is or what, they might have a narrativization of collective hatred or collective. And I think that is the child's, could be the child's notion of collective memory. And Dept, whom we talked about, who says, tactics are these coming together of random memory. So he says that one way we can think of everyday life in collectives and so on is that there is we can ask the question, how is a memory implanted in what is already a fixed ensemble of relationships and so on? How do you get new memories? If everything is collective memory and there are all these ensembles in place, how do we get new memories? How do you implant old memories into new memories? And the only way I can think of is that because language and emotion, it is a hypothesis, grow in tandem, emotions get transmitted through narrative forms, and these narrative forms may be just lullabies, they may be just intonation patterns, they may not be full-formed narratives.